In a city where justice often feels like a fragile promise, Captain Amelia Brooks has spent years building a reputation as a fair and steadfast leader in her precinct. Respected by her colleagues and trusted by the community, Amelia has always believed in the power of the badge to protect and serve. But when a routine stops at a local store spirals into a shocking accusation of theft, Amelia's entire world comes crashing down. Betrayed by a corrupt officer, Henderson, who wields his authority like a weapon, Amelia finds herself framed, humiliated, and hunted by the very system she once upheld. With her reputation hanging by a thread and powerful enemies closing in, she must confront not only the lies surrounding her, but the deeper rot within the department she calls home. Faced with isolation, suspicion, and the risk of losing everything she's worked for, Amelia turns to her trusted partner, Ethan Carter, and a handful of unlikely allies. Together, they begin to uncover the truth one dangerous thread at a time. From whispered confessions to missing evidence and desperate chases through the dark, every step brings them closer to the heart of the conspiracy and the man determined to silence them. But will Amelia's determination to stand for justice be enough to expose the truth? Or will Henderson's relentless pursuit of power destroy her before she can clear her name? It was a warm Wednesday afternoon when Captain Amelia Brooks pulled her unmarked police car into a near-empty parking lot. The sun hung high in the sky, its golden rays glinting off her clean, navy blue uniform. Even with the heat prickling at her neck, Amelia moved with the composure of someone used to far worse conditions. Years of hard work and sacrifice had brought her here, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Central Precinct. It was a position she had earned, not given, and one she protected fiercely. The strip mall she parked at was nothing impressive. The paint peeled from the building walls, and half the stores were shuttered or boarded up. Still, Amelia had a soft spot for this place. Mr. James Patel's convenience store sat tucked into the corner, its neon open sign flickering slightly, as though it too had grown tired after years of duty. Amelia entered the store, the small bell above the door jingling. The cool air hit her immediately, a welcome reprieve from the heat outside. She glanced around the aisle's low shelves lined with snacks, canned goods, and other essentials. Mr. Patel stood behind the counter, a familiar figure with a kind face, wearing his usual buttoned-up shirt and a pair of old reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "Good afternoon, Captain Brooks," Mr. Patel greeted warmly, looking up from a small notebook. "It is always a pleasure to see you." Amelia's lips curved into a smile. "Good to see you too, Mr. Patel. Just stopping in for something quick?" Mr. Patel chuckled softly. "Same thing as usual. Granola bar and water?" "You know me well," Amelia replied, shaking her head with a smile. It had become her routine, a small break between the chaos of her day. She often stopped by here, and in return, Mr. Patel always made a point to ask how she was. Amelia moved through the store, her sharp eyes scanning instinctively. Years of being a police officer had trained her to be aware of everything, even when she was off duty. Today, however, felt different. There was an odd tension in the air, a slight heaviness she could not shake. Maybe it was fatigue from the long hours lately. She brushed the feeling aside and grabbed a bottle of water and a granola bar before heading to the counter. Just as Mr. Patel began ringing up her items, the sound of the door opening caught her attention. Amelia glanced over her shoulder and saw a man she did not recognize, a police officer in uniform. He was young, probably in his early 30s, with short blonde hair and icy blue eyes. His posture was stiff, his arms crossed tightly across his chest as he scanned the store. For some reason, his gaze settled on her. Amelia frowned slightly, turning back to Mr. Patel. "Busy day?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "Always," Mr. Patel replied with a small smile, but his eyes flickered nervously toward the other officer. "You know how it is." Amelia paid for her items and slid the water bottle into her bag. As she turned to leave, She felt the weight of the officer's stare following her. The hairs on the back of her neck bristled, but she ignored it. She was a captain, one of the highest-ranking officers in the department. There was no reason for her to be worried. She pushed open the door, stepping into the sunlight. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice called behind her. Amelia froze mid-step. The voice was sharp and demanding. Slowly, she turned to face the officer, her expression calm but guarded. He had stepped outside, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. His name tag reads Henderson. "Is there a problem, Officer Henderson?" Amelia asked, keeping her voice measured. "I need to see some identification," Henderson said coldly. His tone carried an arrogance that immediately set her on edge. Amelia's brow furrowed. "I'm Captain Amelia Brooks from Central Precinct," she replied, pulling out her badge and holding it up for him to see. "I'm off duty. What is this about?" Henderson's eyes narrowed as he looked at the badge, then back at her. "I saw you acting suspiciously in the store," he said bluntly. "Handling merchandise like you were going to steal it. I'm going to need to see your ID." Amelia felt her chest tighten, the insult hitting her harder than she cared to admit. Suspicious? She had bought a water bottle and a granola bar, hardly suspicious behavior. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice firm. "I paid for my items. Mr. Patel can confirm that." Henderson sneered. "Maybe, but I still need to see your identification." Amelia's patience began to thin, but she remained composed. "You clearly see my badge. I don't need to show you anything more unless you have legitimate cause." The smirk on Henderson's face faded, replaced by something darker. "I do have cause," he snapped. "I saw what I saw. You are resisting an officer's request." Amelia's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Years of training had taught her to remain calm in tense situations, but this was different. She could feel the weight of what was happening, an accusation based on nothing but her skin color and someone else's misplaced judgment. "This is a mistake," Amelia said, her voice low and steady. "You need to stop this now." Henderson's hand tightened on his holster. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Amelia stared at him in disbelief. Her heart raced in her chest as her mind scrambled for a way out of this. She had been in hostile situations before, but never on the receiving end like this. Not here, not in broad daylight, and not as a police captain. "I said turn around," Henderson barked. Reluctantly, Amelia turned, the humiliation settling deep in her stomach as she placed her hands behind her back. The sharp click of the handcuffs closing around her wrists echoed in her ears like a gunshot. A small crowd had begun to gather, a couple of pedestrians, a teenager pulling out his phone, and Mr. Patel, who stood frozen behind the glass window of the store. His expression was one of horror, but he did not move. Amelia kept her head high as Henderson gripped her arm and led her to his patrol car. The sun beat down on her, and the world seemed to blur at the edges. She could hear the faint murmurs of people watching, the whispers of disbelief. "Is that a cop? She didn't do anything. This is insane." For a moment, Amelia wanted to scream, to shout to the heavens that this was wrong, that it was unjust, that it should not be happening to someone like her. But she stayed silent. At the car, Henderson shoved her into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind her. Amelia stared out through the wire mesh divider at the world outside. Her wrists ached, the metal cuffs biting into her skin, but it was nothing compared to the shame burning deep inside her. This was not just an arrest, it was a violation. It was a stripping away of everything she had worked for, her years of service, her title, and her dignity. As the car pulled away, Amelia spotted someone running toward the parking lot, a young woman, her face determined and familiar. It was the same woman from inside the store. She waved her arms, shouting, but Henderson did not stop. Amelia leaned back in the seat, taking slow breaths to calm her racing heart. "Do not let him see you break," she thought. "Do not give him the satisfaction." In the distance, As the patrol car sped toward the station, Amelia let her gaze fall on the horizon. Her mind was already moving, calculating her next steps. There was no doubt in her mind that this would get worse before it got better, but she would not be broken. She could not be. As the car approached the precinct, Amelia whispered to herself, "This is not the end. I will not let it be the end." The hum of the patrol car engine filled the silence as Captain Amelia Brooks sat stiffly in the back seat. The unyielding metal cuffs around her wrists bit into her skin, and every jolt of the car sent a fresh wave of discomfort through her shoulders. But Amelia ignored the pain. She refused to let Kyle Henderson see her sweat, even from the rearview mirror. The glass divider reflected her image, a high-ranking officer reduced to a suspect, her face set in grim determination. This was not the end, she reminded herself. It could not be. The precinct loomed ahead, its brick walls and buzzing activity familiar, but suddenly foreign. Amelia had spent years in those halls giving orders, solving cases, and building a team she trusted. It was her second home. Now those walls felt like a trap, closing in on her with every passing second. When Henderson finally pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine, Amelia sat frozen. He climbed out of the car and yanked open the back door, grabbing her arm roughly. "Move!" he barked. Amelia stepped out of the car, holding her chin high. She would not let him rob her of her dignity, no matter how hard he tried. The sun was unforgiving, and a few officers standing by the entrance froze mid-conversation, their faces turning to stone as they saw her. Amelia could hear the murmurs low, questioning voices carried by the breeze. "Is that Captain Brooks?" "No way." "What happened?" Amelia refused to look at them. She focused on the path ahead, taking deliberate steps as Henderson marched her inside. The station lobby buzzed with activity. Phones rang, conversations filled the air, and the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than usual. But when Amelia entered, the noise dimmed. Heads turned, and the room seemed to collectively inhale. She spotted a few familiar faces, officers and detectives she had worked alongside for years. Some looked confused. Others averted their eyes, as if unsure how to process what they were seeing. "Keep moving," Henderson said, his grip tightening. Amelia did not resist. She walked calmly past her colleagues, each step echoing in her ears like a drumbeat. This was a place where she had always commanded respect, and now she felt like an unwelcome stranger. As they reached the booking area, Henderson shoved her toward the desk. Officer Reynolds, a gruff man with gray at his temples and tired eyes, looked up from his paperwork. His expression shifted from irritation to shock. "Captain Brooks?" Reynolds' brow furrowed as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on here?" "Suspected theft," Henderson said, slapping a file down on the desk with a smirk. "Caught her at Patel's store acting suspicious." Reynolds blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Suspected theft? Are you serious?" Henderson's jaw tightened. "You heard me. Just process her." Reynolds hesitated, his eyes meeting Amelia's. She held his gaze, steady and unflinching. "You know me, Reynolds. I didn't do this." The older officer's shoulders sagged slightly. "This doesn't make any sense." "It's not supposed to," Amelia replied quietly. Reynolds sighed, looking between Henderson and Amelia. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly conflicted. "Protocol is protocol," he muttered finally. "I'm sorry, Captain. I'll get this over with quickly." The processing began. Amelia gritted her teeth as her fingerprints were taken, her fingers pressed firmly onto the cold ink pad. Each step of the process was a fresh humiliation, one she had seen countless suspects endure over the years. She never imagined she would be on the other side of it. The final blow came when Reynolds motioned toward the wall with a camera. "We need a mug shot," he said softly, as if apologizing with his tone. Amelia swallowed hard. She stepped in front of the camera, shoulders square and chin lifted. The bright flash was blinding, but it passed in an instant. She refused to let it break her. All right, I'll get her paperwork sorted, Reynolds said, his voice laced with discomfort. He turned to Henderson. Where do you want her? Henderson smirked. Put her in holding. Amelia's heart sank. This is unnecessary, and you know it, she said, her voice sharp. Maybe, Henderson replied smugly, his eyes glinting with something sinister. But I'm following the rules, Captain. Before Amelia could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. What is going on here? The voice belonged to Lieutenant Rachel Foster. She appeared at the edge of the room, her sharp gaze flicking between Henderson, Reynolds, and Amelia. Foster was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her 40s. Her salt-and-pepper hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her presence alone commanded attention. Lieutenant, Henderson said, his smirk faltering. I can see what you were just doing, Foster interrupted, her tone icy. Reynolds, uncuff her. Reynolds did not hesitate. He quickly unlocked the cuffs from Amelia's wrists, the metal clinking as it fell away. Amelia rolled her shoulders, relief mingling with simmering anger. Foster turned to Henderson, her blue eyes blazing. What exactly is your justification for arresting Captain Amelia Brooks? Henderson squared his jaw. She was acting suspicious in a store. I had reasonable cause. Foster's expression darkened. Suspicious? I see no evidence here. You arrested one of the most respected captains in this precinct without concrete proof? Henderson's confidence flickered for a split second, but he masked it quickly. I followed protocol. We will see about that, Foster said coldly. She turned to Amelia. Are you all right? Amelia nodded, though the ache in her wrists and the weight in her chest were impossible to ignore. I am fine, Lieutenant. Thank you. Foster's gaze softened slightly. Let's talk. In private. Amelia followed Foster into a small office tucked away from the chaos of the station. Foster closed the door behind them and gestured for Amelia to sit. Amelia sank into the chair, letting out a slow breath as Foster settled across from her. Are you going to tell me what happened? Foster asked, her tone gentler now. Amelia recounted the events, how Henderson accused her in the store, his refusal to listen, and the public humiliation that followed. As she spoke, her voice remained steady, but the emotions beneath it simmered close to the surface. Foster listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Amelia finished, Foster leaned back in her chair, her fingers interlaced. I believe you, Foster said finally. Amelia blinked, momentarily stunned. You do? Foster nodded. I have known you for years, Brooks. I know your character, your work, and your integrity. Henderson has always been reckless, but this feels deliberate. Amelia felt a rush of gratitude. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone believed her. Thank you, she said quietly. But, Foster added, her tone grave, this is not over. You know how these things work. Henderson will not back down easily, and now your name is caught up in this mess. We need to move carefully and gather evidence. Amelia nodded. I understand. Good, Foster replied. Because I will help you fight this. You are not alone. Those words hit Amelia harder than she expected. After hours of feeling betrayed, shamed, and isolated, hearing someone say you are not alone felt like a lifeline. What do we do first? Amelia asked, her determination returning. Foster's lips pressed into a thin line. We find out exactly what Henderson is up to, and we get proof to clear your name. As Amelia left the office and walked through the precinct, she could feel the weight of the stairs still following her. The whispers lingered in the air, like a storm waiting to break. But something had shifted within her. She was not broken, she was not alone, and she was going to fight back. Amelia sat quietly in her living room later that night, the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall, the only sound filling the space. She stared blankly at the file folder on her coffee table, its presence a reminder of how quickly her world had shifted. A day that started with routine had turned into a nightmare. Her small apartment was usually her sanctuary, a two-bedroom space she had moved into years ago, simple and uncluttered, with personal touches scattered throughout. Framed photos of her family sat on a shelf near the window, and her collection of leadership books filled the bookcase in the corner. It was a place that reflected her organized, disciplined, yet softened by the warmth of her character. But tonight, the room felt heavy and unfamiliar, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch too far. She leaned back on the couch and ran a hand over her face, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. In her line of work, she had seen corruption and abuse of power before. She had helped clean up precincts, restore trust in neighborhoods, and mentor young officers trying to make a difference. Yet now, she was the one caught in the crosshairs. She had to admit it. Henderson's arrogance and calculated moves had shaken her. The sound of her phone buzzing jolted her out of her thoughts. Amelia reached for it, glancing at the screen. It was Ethan Carter, her partner of 5 years, and one of the few people she trusted with her life. "Ethan," she answered, her voice quiet. "Amelia," he said, his tone tense. "You holding up?" She hesitated, her hand tightening around the phone. "I'm managing. I don't have a choice." There was silence for a moment before Ethan spoke again, softer this time. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Amelia exhaled. "Foster said the same thing earlier." "She's right," Ethan replied firmly. "I've been hearing things around the precinct. Henderson's already spreading his version of what happened. Some of the younger guys are eating it up, but the rest of us, we know something's off." Amelia sat up straighter. "What are they saying?" Ethan sighed. "Henderson's painting you as hostile, that you refused to cooperate because you thought you were above the law. He's trying to turn this into an ego thing, Amelia, and it's working with some of them." The weight of those words hit her hard, but she forced herself to stay focused. "That doesn't matter," she said, her voice steady. "What matters is clearing my name. Henderson is hiding something, and I need your help." "I'm already on it," Ethan said quickly. "I dug into the incident report from the store. Something's not adding up." "What do you mean?" "The report claims the store clerk filed a complaint about the missing bracelet 2 days ago, but the timing is too clean, too convenient. It feels like Henderson set this up in advance." Amelia's pulse quickened. "Henry Walker," she murmured, recalling the nervous clerk behind the counter that afternoon. "Exactly," Ethan confirmed. "If anyone knows what really happened, it's him. We need to talk to him, Amelia, preferably before Henderson gets to him again." Amelia stood, pacing the length of her living room. "Henry was terrified when Henderson walked into that store. He knows something, but he's afraid." "That's because Henderson put the fear in him," Ethan replied. "But maybe if we talk to him, we can get him to open up. You've got a way with people, Amelia. If anyone can convince him to tell the truth, it's you." Amelia stopped pacing and leaned against the window, staring out at the quiet street below. For the first time all day, a flicker of hope stirred in her chest. "Meet me tomorrow morning," she said finally. "We'll go to the store together." "Already planned on it," Ethan said with a faint smile in his voice. "We'll get through this, Amelia, one step at a time." After ending the call, Amelia lingered by the window for a while longer. Outside, the streetlights cast long, thin shadows across the pavement. She watched a young couple walk by, laughing softly, their carefree energy so at odds with her reality. Her thoughts drifted back to the store earlier that day. In the middle of that humiliating scene, there had been a moment of unexpected kindness. That young woman, she had whispered, "I saw everything. I'll tell someone." It had been such a small gesture, but it meant everything to Amelia. A stranger had offered her a thread of solidarity when the rest of the world seemed to turn its back. She stepped away from the window and sat back on the couch, her mind sharpening. Henderson thought he had her backed into a corner, but he underestimated her. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, fighting for others. Now, she would fight for herself. The next morning, Amelia and Ethan pulled up to Patel's convenience store, the morning sun warming the pavement. The strip mall was quiet again, with just a few cars parked nearby. Amelia's nerves were steady, but she could feel the tension humming beneath the surface. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the store entrance. "You ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Amelia replied. Together, they stepped out of the car and walked toward the store. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, and Mr. Patel looked up from behind the counter. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Amelia, but he said nothing. "Good morning, Mr. Patel," Amelia said politely, her voice calm. "We're looking for Henry Walker. Is he here?" Mr. Patel hesitated. He glanced nervously over his shoulder toward the stockroom, then back at Amelia and Ethan. "He is in the back," he said quietly. "But please, do not cause trouble." "We're just here to talk," Ethan assured him. Amelia followed Mr. Patel's gaze toward the narrow hallway leading to the back. She and Ethan walked carefully, their footsteps muffled against the tile floor. When they reached the stockroom, they found Henry sitting on a small crate, sorting through inventory. He jumped when he saw them, nearly dropping the clipboard in his hand. His thin face went pale, and he fidgeted with his pen. "Captain Brooks," he stammered, looking from her to Ethan nervously. "I already told the police everything I know." Amelia stepped closer, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "Henry, I'm not here to accuse you," she said gently. "I'm here to ask for the truth. I know Henderson has been pressuring you." Henry's gaze darted to the floor. I don't know what you're talking about." Ethan spoke up, his tone softer than Amelia expected. "We're not here to get you in trouble, Henry. We're here to stop Henderson from dragging innocent people down with him. That includes you." Henry swallowed hard, still avoiding their eyes. Amelia crouched slightly, so she was at his level. "Henry," she said softly, "I know you're afraid, but I need you to understand something. Henderson is setting me up, and you're the key to stopping him. If you tell the truth now, you can help put an end to this." Henry's hands trembled as he gripped the clipboard. For a moment, he said nothing. Amelia was about to speak again when he blurted, "He told me to lie." Amelia froze, meeting Ethan's surprised gaze before turning back to Henry. "Henderson came here 2 days ago," Henry continued, his voice shaking. "He told me to report the bracelet missing. He said I wouldn't get in trouble if I cooperated. I didn't want to, but he was so insistent." Amelia's jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. She placed a steadying hand on Henry's shoulder. "Thank you for telling us, Henry," she said softly. "You did the right thing." "What happens now?" Henry asked, his voice small. Ethan straightened. "We'll need you to make a formal statement, and we'll take it from there." Henry nodded, though he still looked pale and scared. As Amelia and Ethan turned to leave, Amelia paused at the door. "Henry," she said, glancing back at him, "this took courage. I won't forget it." Henry managed a weak smile, and for the first time in days, Amelia felt like she was one step closer to the truth. The drive back to Amelia's apartment was quiet, the low hum of the car engine the only sound between her and Ethan. Henry Walker's confession still echoed in Amelia's mind, but so did the young clerk's trembling hands and pale face. Fear had been etched into every word he spoke, and Amelia could not shake the image. "Henry did the right thing," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was steady but filled with caution. "But we both know Henderson's not going to sit quietly while we use that against him." Amelia gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles pale against the black leather. She had been thinking the same thing. Henderson was too calculated, too confident. He would not let Henry's words stand without retaliation. "He knows we're coming for him," Amelia replied, her tone grim. "Henry is a liability now. I need to make sure he's protected." Ethan nodded. "I'll file a request to have Henry put under protective watch. We'll get him out of harm's way while we move forward." Amelia glanced at him, gratitude flickering briefly across her face. "Thanks, Ethan." He smirked faintly. "You don't have to thank me. You'd do the same for me, and you know it." The truth of that hung in the air between them. Amelia had always believed in looking out for her team, standing firm when it mattered most. Now the tables had turned, and Ethan's unwavering support was becoming her anchor. It reminded her that she was not alone, no matter how isolated she felt. As they pulled up to Amelia's building, Ethan leaned back in his seat, watching her carefully. "So what's next? What are we really up against here?" Amelia sighed, leaning against the steering wheel. "We need more than Henry's confession. We need evidence that Henderson tampered with the incident report and manipulated the case. If we can prove that, it'll unravel everything he's done." Ethan's eyes narrowed in thought. "And the footage? The security cameras from the store?" Amelia shook her head. "Foster said the footage was edited, key parts missing. Henderson had to be the one who tampered with it. That means the originals are out there somewhere. Which means we need to find them before he destroys them," Ethan said, sitting up straighter. "What about Foster? Will she back us up?" "She will," Amelia replied, confidence threading through her voice. "But she's careful, and she has to move through the right channels. We don't have that luxury. We need to be faster than Henderson." Ethan smirked again, his usual humor returning for a moment. "I knew you'd say that. It's why you're the best captain we've got." Amelia allowed herself a small smile as she opened the car door. "Get Henry into protective custody tonight. I'll meet you first thing tomorrow. We'll figure out our next move." Inside her apartment, the silence wrapped around Amelia like a heavy blanket. The relief of having Henry's confession was short-lived. Her mind raced, cataloging the pieces of the puzzle and the dangers ahead. She sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. Henderson had underestimated her resolve, but that was not what unsettled her most. It was how thoroughly he had planned this, how easily he had manipulated the system, turning her into a suspect overnight. If he had done it to her, how many others had he done it to before? Amelia glanced at the photo on her shelf, her mother's smiling face framed in soft gold. Her mother had been the first to teach her resilience. Growing up in a small, struggling neighborhood, Amelia had watched her mother work tirelessly to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. No matter how many doors slammed in her face, she never gave up. "Hard times don't last, Amelia," her mother would say, "but strong people do." The words came back to her now, comforting her in the quiet. A sudden knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Amelia frowned, rising cautiously. She checked the peephole, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Lieutenant Rachel Foster standing outside. Amelia quickly opened the door. "Lieutenant, what are you doing here?" Foster stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her expression tense. She carried a small envelope tucked under her arm. "I wanted to check on you," Foster said, glancing around the modest apartment as Amelia closed the door behind her. "And I thought you'd want to see this." "What is it?" Amelia asked, motioning for Foster to sit. Foster set the envelope on the coffee table and slid a single printed photo from it. Amelia's stomach tightened as she looked at it, a grainy image taken from the convenience store security footage. It showed her at the counter with Mr. Patel, handing him money. "I had someone pull this from the edited footage," Foster explained. "It's not the clearest shot, but it proves you paid for your items. Henderson's narrative is already starting to fall apart." Amelia stared at the image, a spark of relief rising in her chest. It was small, just a moment frozen in time, but it was something. "How did you get this?" Foster leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze softening. "I pulled a few favors. Not everyone in the department believes Henderson's lies, Amelia. You've earned a lot of loyalty over the years, and people are starting to ask questions." Amelia's throat tightened, and she looked away, blinking hard. The weight of everything was pressing down on her, but Foster's words cut through the darkness. "Thank you," Amelia said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Foster shook her head. Don't thank me yet. Henderson isn't going to go down without a fight. He's already spreading rumors about you, trying to control the narrative. You need to be ready for whatever comes next." Amelia nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready." "Good," Foster said, standing up. "I'll keep digging on my end. But you and Ethan need to find the unedited footage. That's our smoking gun." As Foster left, Amelia sat back down, the photo still in her hand. She studied it closely, letting the truth of it settle over her. It was proof small but undeniable. Henderson's web of lies was starting to unravel, thread by thread. The next morning, Amelia and Ethan met in a diner not far from the precinct. It was a quiet, family-run spot with red leather booths and the smell of fresh coffee hanging in the air. Ethan was already seated when Amelia arrived, a folder spread out in front of him. "Morning, Captain," Ethan said, offering her a cup of coffee as she slid into the booth across from him. "Morning," Amelia replied, taking the cup gratefully. She glanced at the folder. "What did you find?" Ethan's expression was serious as he tapped the papers. "I dug into the incident report like I said. The timeline's off, Amelia. Henderson filed the report before the alleged theft even happened." Amelia's eyes widened. "What?" "He backdated it," Ethan confirmed. "Henry's confession lines up. Henderson orchestrated the whole thing. He set you up days in advance. He planned to corner you at the store." Amelia exhaled slowly, anger simmering in her chest. "He thought of everything." "Almost," Ethan corrected. "He didn't think we'd fight back." Amelia gave him a small smile, determination rising within her. "He doesn't know us very well then." Ethan's grin was faint, but steady. "We need to find that footage, Amelia. If Henderson's this desperate, he'll stop at nothing to make sure it never sees the light of day." Amelia nodded, her jaw tight. "We'll find it, and when we do, we're taking him down." As they left the diner and walked toward the car, Amelia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, her steps faltering. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're making a mistake. Stop digging before it's too late." Amelia's pulse quickened, but she shoved the phone back into her pocket. "What is it?" Ethan asked, noticing her expression. Amelia shook her head. "Nothing we can't handle." She looked out at the city around her, a storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Henderson was watching them, trying to intimidate them, but he had no idea how much fight she had left. Amelia Brooks had not come this far to back down now. The wind swept briskly through the streets that morning as Amelia and Ethan sat parked in an unmarked car a few blocks away from the strip mall. The sky was overcast, gray clouds threatening rain, mirroring the heavy tension that sat in Amelia's chest. They were waiting for Henry Walker to leave his apartment so they could escort him to the precinct safely. After his confession yesterday, Amelia knew Henry was now in danger. Henderson would come for him. It was only a matter of time. Ethan tapped impatiently on the steering wheel, his gaze scanning the street. "He's late," he muttered, glancing at his watch. Amelia frowned, her eyes fixed on the building's door. Henry's nervousness the day before hadn't left her mind. "We'll give him a few more minutes," she replied, though unease was already curling in her gut. Ethan exhaled sharply and leaned back in his seat. "I don't like this, Amelia. We should have put him in protective custody last night. Henderson's not stupid. He knows Henry's the weak link." Amelia tightened her grip on the edge of her seat. Ethan was right. Henry's confession had given them leverage, but it also put a target on his back. She glanced at her phone for the 5th time, hoping to see a message from Henry, but her screen stayed dark. Just then, the apartment building door creaked open, and Henry stepped out onto the sidewalk. He was wearing the same rumpled shirt from yesterday, his movements hurried and nervous. He clutched a small bag to his chest and glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, as if expecting someone to follow him. "There he is," Ethan said, starting the engine. Amelia nodded, relief threading through her voice. "Let's get him out of here." They pulled up alongside the curb, and Henry's face paled when he saw the car. He hesitated for a split second before darting over and climbing into the back seat. "Henry?" Amelia greeted calmly, though her eyes searched his face. "You all right?" He nodded quickly, his hands trembling as he fidgeted with the bag on his lap. I didn't sleep," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I kept thinking, what if he comes after me?" Amelia turned in her seat, softening her tone. "You're not alone anymore. We're going to protect you, and we're going to stop him." Henry's eyes darted between Amelia and Ethan, uncertainty still etched on his face, but he nodded. "Okay." Ethan pulled the car back onto the road. "We're taking you to the precinct. Lieutenant Foster will meet us there. You'll make a formal statement, and we'll get everything on record." Henry swallowed hard and stared out the window. "I didn't think it'd get this far," he muttered. I didn't want to lose my job." Amelia's chest tightened at his words. Henry was not the enemy here. He was another victim of Henderson's manipulation. "It's not your fault," she said quietly. "Henderson preyed on your fear, but you did the right thing by telling us the truth." Henry didn't respond, but his shoulders relaxed slightly as they drove on in silence. The precinct lobby was buzzing with energy when Amelia, Ethan, and Henry arrived. Officers passed by with case files, phones rang incessantly, and the low hum of conversations filled the air. But as soon as Amelia walked through the door, the noise seemed to dim, heads turning as they always did now. Whispers followed her as they walked through the station, but she ignored them, keeping her focus on Henry, who looked like he wanted to disappear. "Keep your head up," Ethan murmured, his voice low. "They'll see the truth soon enough." Amelia appreciated his words, though the weight of the stairs still pressed down on her. Lieutenant Foster was waiting for them in a small conference room at the back of the station. She stood when they entered, her expression stern but welcoming. "Henry," she said, nodding to him, "thank you for coming." Henry sank into one of the chairs at the table, his face pale as he avoided her gaze. "I just want this to be over," he muttered. "It will be," Foster replied firmly, taking a seat across from him. "But we need you to make a formal statement. We're going to document everything you told Captain Brooks and Officer Carter yesterday, how Henderson coerced you into filing that false report, and what really happened at the store." Henry nodded, his hands still fidgeting nervously in his lap. "Take your time," Amelia said gently, sitting beside him. "You're doing the right thing." Ethan moved to stand near the door, his posture relaxed but alert, like a silent guardian. Foster switched on a small recorder, and the room fell silent for a moment before Henry began speaking. His voice trembled at first, but as he recounted Henderson's threats and manipulation, he grew steadier, his words clearer. Amelia listened carefully, her heart swelling with pride for the young man who was finding his courage despite the fear. When Henry finished, Foster stopped the recorder and gave him a small nod. "You did good," she said quietly. "We'll protect you, Henry. You have my word." Henry exhaled shakily, his relief palpable. "Thank you," he murmured. Foster turned to Amelia and Ethan, her tone shifting to business. "I'll add his statement to the file. Between this and the photo from the edited footage, we're building a solid case." Amelia nodded. "It's a start, but we still need that original footage." Foster's expression darkened. "I've been pulling strings to get the store's unedited security tapes, but someone's been blocking access. Henderson has to be involved." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "Then we find it another way." Foster raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" "Break the chain," Amelia replied. "We go to the source, the store owner, Mr. Patel. Henderson didn't get to Henry first by accident. He must have approached Patel too." Foster nodded slowly. "It's worth a shot. If we can get Patel on record or recover the footage directly, Henderson won't have anywhere to hide." "I'll go talk to Patel tonight," Amelia said, determination clear in her voice. "I'll go with you," Ethan added. "We're not taking any chances." Foster stood, her sharp gaze settling on Amelia. "Be careful. Henderson knows you're closing in, and the closer you get, the more dangerous he'll become." "I can handle it," Amelia replied firmly. Foster held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "I know you can. Just don't let your guard down." That evening, Amelia and Ethan stood outside Patel's convenience store as the streetlights cast pools of yellow light onto the pavement. The small strip mall was quieter than usual, and Mr. Patel's store glowed faintly behind the window. "Ready?" Ethan asked. Amelia nodded. "Let's get this done." They stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. Mr. Patel looked up from behind the counter, his face etched with worry the moment he saw them. "Captain Brooks," he greeted, though his voice was hesitant. "Back again?" Amelia approached the counter, her tone calm but serious. "Mr. Patel, we need to talk." Mr. Patel's eyes darted nervously toward the empty aisles. "About what?" Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "About Henderson." Mr. Patel's hands stilled, and the color drained from his face. He looked away, shaking his head. I do not want trouble." Amelia leaned in slightly, her voice gentle. "You know what he's doing is wrong, Mr. Patel. You don't have to let him use you." Mr. Patel's shoulders sagged, his gaze dropping to the counter. "He came to me last week," he whispered finally. "He said it was a simple report, nothing serious. But then, he came back after everything happened. He said I should keep quiet, or I would regret it." Amelia's heart sank, though she kept her face steady. "Do you still have the original security footage?" Mr. Patel hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It is on my computer. He told me to delete it, but I could not. I kept a copy." Ethan exchanged a sharp glance with Amelia, hope flashing in his eyes. "Mr. Patel," Amelia said, her voice filled with quiet gratitude, "you just did the right thing. You can help us put an end to this." Mr. Patel swallowed hard but nodded. "I will give you the footage." As he moved to retrieve the file, Amelia allowed herself to exhale, the weight on her chest easing slightly. They were one step closer to the truth, but deep down, she knew Henderson would not let this go without a fight. The drive back from Mr. Patel's store was quiet, the tension in the car a tangible weight. Ethan sat in the passenger seat with the small flash drive clutched tightly in his hand, as though he expected it to vanish at any moment. The significance of what they held was not lost on either of them. This single file, the unedited footage, was the thread that could unravel Henderson's entire plot. "This is it, Amelia," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. "This footage proves you didn't steal anything. It shows Henderson's lies for what they are." Amelia nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across her face. "It's what we've been waiting for, but we're not out of this yet. Henderson knows we're close. He won't go down quietly." Ethan's expression darkened. "Let him try. He's not going to win this." Amelia appreciated Ethan's confidence, but deep down, she knew better than to underestimate Henderson. He was dangerous, not because he was particularly intelligent, but because he was desperate. A man like that would burn everything around him to keep his secrets buried. "Foster will meet us at the station," Amelia said, turning onto a quiet road. "We'll give her the footage and start the process of bringing this to light." Ethan nodded, but his posture remained stiff, his body tensed like a coiled spring. Amelia could feel it too, an electric hum of unease that ran beneath the surface. Every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, she half expected to see headlights following them, a dark figure lurking in the shadows. "Do you think Henderson knows we have this yet?" Ethan asked quietly. Amelia shook her head. "Not yet, but he will soon. And when he does, he'll come for us." As they approached the precinct, Amelia's phone buzzed on the console. She glanced at the screen. It was Lieutenant Foster. She picked it up quickly, putting it on speaker. "Lieutenant? Where are you?" Foster's voice was tight, urgent. 5 minutes from the station, Amelia replied, her knuckles whitening on the wheel. We've got the footage. There was a pause before Foster said, Turn around. Do not come here. Amelia's chest tightened. What? Why? Henderson knows, Foster said grimly. Somehow, he found out you were at Patel's store. He's already at the station spreading more lies, saying you're tampering with evidence and intimidating witnesses. I don't know how, but he's convinced a few of the higher-ups to look into it. Amelia's blood ran cold. He's trying to flip this on me again. Exactly, Foster said. And if you walk in there right now, they'll take that flash drive from you. Henderson has his claws in the system, and until we get this into the right hands, you're at risk. Ethan let out a sharp breath. So, what do we do? There was a brief pause on the line before Foster said, Get somewhere safe. I'll figure out a plan. Do not let that footage out of your sight. The call ended abruptly, leaving silence hanging heavy in the car. Amelia's heart pounded as she gripped the wheel. We can't go to the station. Ethan turned to her, his voice steady but tense. Then we find a place to lay low until Foster calls us back. Amelia thought quickly, mentally scanning through options. Her apartment was out. Henderson would have people watching it. Ethan's place was probably compromised too. My aunt's cabin, Amelia said suddenly. It's about an hour outside the city. She's out of town and no one knows about it. Ethan nodded. Let's go. The cabin sat nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees that cast long shadows in the moonlight. By the time they arrived, the night was heavy and still, the air cool against Amelia's skin as she stepped out of the car. The cabin was small and modest, a structure her aunt had inherited years ago and used as a retreat from city life. Remote, Ethan muttered, glancing around as he pulled the flash drive from his pocket. No one will find us here. That's the point, Amelia replied. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Amelia switched on a small lamp in the corner, its warm glow chasing away the darkness. The furniture was sparse: a couch, a small table, and a bookshelf filled with old novels. The silence here was almost unnerving after the chaos of the last few days. Ethan dropped into a chair and opened his laptop, setting the flash drive down beside him. We need to make copies of this footage. If Henderson's willing to do all this, we can't risk losing it. Amelia nodded, pulling out her phone to check for any messages from Foster. Nothing yet. She walked to the window and peered out into the woods, the moonlight barely piercing through the dense trees. It felt safe here, hidden away from prying eyes, but Amelia could not shake the feeling that Henderson was still out there, hunting them. Amelia, Ethan said, his voice pulling her attention back. Come look at this. She moved quickly to his side as he clicked through the video file. The footage played on the screen, showing the unedited events from the convenience store. There she was, at the counter, handing Mr. Patel the money and taking the receipt. Clear as day, the truth was right there. Ethan paused the video and leaned back. This is it. This clears you. Amelia exhaled slowly, the weight on her chest easing just a fraction. We need to get this to someone who can't be swayed, someone outside Henderson's reach. Ethan nodded. We'll figure it out, but for now, let's make those copies. The hours stretched on, the silence of the cabin broken only by the hum of Ethan's laptop. Amelia paced restlessly, her mind racing with everything that had happened. Her thoughts kept circling back to Henderson. How had he known? How did he keep staying one step ahead? Amelia, Ethan said suddenly, his tone sharp. She turned to find him staring at his phone, his face pale. What is it? Ethan handed her the phone wordlessly. On the screen was a text message from an unknown number. We know where you are. You can't hide forever. Amelia's stomach dropped. How did they? The sound of tires crunching gravel outside cut her off. Both of them froze. Amelia's pulse thundered in her ears as she moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain. A pair of headlights pierced through the trees, growing closer with every passing second. "It's him," she said, her voice tight. Ethan slammed the laptop shut and grabbed the flash drive. "We need to move. Now!" Amelia grabbed her jacket and tucked her gun into its holster. The headlights stopped a short distance away, and the sound of car doors slamming echoed in the still night. She could hear voices now low, angry murmurs, and the unmistakable sound of boots crunching over leaves. "Out the back," Amelia whispered, motioning for Ethan to follow. They slipped through the back door and into the woods, the darkness swallowing them. The cold air stung Amelia's face as they moved quickly, the branches snapping underfoot. Behind them, she could hear shouting Henderson's voice barking orders. "They went this way." Ethan swore under his breath, keeping pace beside her. "We need to circle back to the car." Amelia nodded, her mind racing. She had trained for situations like this, how to escape, how to evade pursuit, but it was different when the enemy was someone you had once trusted to wear the same badge. A gunshot rang out, shattering the silence. Amelia ducked instinctively, her heart hammering in her chest. "They're shooting at us," Ethan hissed. "They're desperate," Amelia replied breathlessly. "Come on." They moved through the trees, weaving their way back toward the gravel road where they had parked. The shouting behind them grew fainter, but Amelia knew better than to let her guard down. Henderson would not stop until he had the footage, or them. As they reached the edge of the woods, Ethan pulled out the flash drive and handed it to Amelia. "Take this. Get to the car. I'll draw them off." "No," Amelia said firmly, shaking her head. "We stick together." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of footsteps nearby made both of them freeze. Amelia turned her head sharply and saw flashlights bobbing in the distance. "We don't have time for this," she whispered. "Let's move." Together, they sprinted toward the car, their footsteps blending with the rustle of leaves. Amelia's lungs burned, but she refused to stop. The truth was within reach, and she would not let Henderson win. The tires skidded across the gravel road as Amelia sped away from the cabin, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The world outside was a blur of darkness and shifting shadows, the headlights carving narrow tunnels of light through the dense woods. Ethan sat beside her, breathing hard, his eyes flicking between the side mirrors and the road ahead. "You think we lost them?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. Amelia didn't answer immediately, her focus locked on the twisting road. She had been driving for nearly 15 minutes, taking back routes and dirt paths to put as much distance as possible between them and Henderson. Finally, after another sharp turn, she allowed herself to exhale, though the weight in her chest remained. "For now," she replied, glancing in the rearview mirror. "But they'll keep looking." Ethan ran a hand through his short hair, his frustration evident. "We need a plan. Running around like this isn't going to help us get ahead of him." "I know," Amelia said quietly. Her mind raced, trying to piece together their next move. The flash drive containing the unedited footage sat in her pocket, a small but powerful piece of evidence that could finally expose Henderson's lies. But it wouldn't matter if they couldn't get it into the right hands. Henderson had already proven he had influence in the department, enough to convince people to look the other way or actively work against her. Ethan broke the silence. "Who can we trust to handle this? Foster is on our side, but Henderson's got enough sway to poison anyone else's opinion." Amelia gripped the wheel tighter, thinking of Foster and the risk she was taking by helping them. The lieutenant was sharp and respected, but Amelia worried how much pressure Henderson and his allies might put on her. "We need to go above the precinct," Amelia said firmly. "The evidence has to go to someone untouchable. Internal Affairs? Or the district attorney?" Ethan nodded, though his jaw tightened. "That's a tall order when we've got Henderson breathing down our necks." "I don't see another way," Amelia replied. "We just need to stay ahead of him long enough to get this into the right hands." Amelia pulled the car into an abandoned gas station just off the main road. The building was a hollow shell, cracked windows, peeling paint, and graffiti scrawled across the walls. The parking lot was empty, the only sound the faint hum of crickets in the distance. She cut the engine and turned to Ethan. "We need to regroup," she said. "Figure out exactly how we're going to do this." Ethan nodded and climbed out of the car, stretching his legs while keeping his eyes on the road for any sign of headlights. Amelia followed, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she leaned against the hood. The tension in her shoulders remained, her instincts still on high alert. "Do you ever think about it?" Ethan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Amelia glanced at him. "Think about what?" "Why we're doing this," he replied, his voice low but steady. "Why we chose this job in the first place. Nights like this make you wonder if it's worth it." Amelia looked out at the empty road, her thoughts drifting back to the early days of her career. She had joined the force with the belief that the badge stood for justice, that it was a symbol of hope for people who needed someone to fight for them. She thought of the communities she had served, the lives she had touched, and the trust she had spent years building. "I think about it all the time," she said finally. "But at the end of the day, the job is bigger than people like Henderson. It's about the people we protect, the ones who can't protect themselves. That's what keeps me going." Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Amelia managed a faint smile in return. "Someone has to be." As they sat in the quiet, Amelia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out quickly, her heart jumping when she saw Lieutenant Foster's name on the screen. "Foster?" she answered, pressing the phone to her ear. "Where are you?" Foster's voice was sharp and urgent. "I just got word Henderson's gone rogue. He's not at the station anymore, and no one can reach him." Amelia's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" "It means he's out there looking for you," Foster replied. "And he's not alone. I overheard him talking to a couple of officers before he left. He's spinning this as you resisting arrest and interfering with an investigation. He's turning people against you, Amelia." Amelia closed her eyes for a brief moment, the weight of Foster's words sinking in. "And Henry? Is he safe?" "For now," Foster said. "I had him moved to a secure location under my supervision, but Henderson will use anything and anyone to bring you down. You need to move fast." "We've got the footage," Amelia said, her voice firm. "We're going to get it to Internal Affairs." "Be careful," Foster warned. "Henderson won't stop until he's got you cornered." The call ended, leaving Amelia and Ethan staring at each other. "We don't have time to waste," Ethan said, his tone urgent. "We get this footage to Internal Affairs now, or Henderson wins." Amelia nodded, her jaw tight. "Let's go." The drive back into the city felt longer than it should have. The roads were quiet, but every set of headlights in the distance made Amelia's pulse spike. She knew Henderson was out there, somewhere, waiting for the chance to strike. As they pulled onto the freeway, Ethan checked his phone. "I just sent Foster the route we're taking. She said she'll meet us at the IA office with backup." "Good," Amelia replied, though the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. Suddenly, a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, closing in fast. Amelia's breath hitched as she glanced back. The black SUV barreling toward them was moving too quickly to be just another car on the road. "Ethan," she said sharply. "I see it," Ethan replied, twisting in his seat to get a better look. "It's them." The SUV sped up, its grille gleaming menacingly under the streetlights as it veered into their lane. Amelia gritted her teeth and slammed her foot on the gas, the car surging forward. "They're trying to run us off the road," Ethan shouted. "Hold on," Amelia yelled, gripping the wheel tightly as she swerved to avoid the SUV. The other car rammed into their bumper, the impact jolting through Amelia's body. She fought to keep control, her heart hammering in her chest. "They're not stopping," Ethan shouted, bracing himself against the dashboard. Amelia's mind raced. She couldn't let Henderson get the footage, not when they were this close. Ahead, she spotted an exit ramp leading toward an industrial area, empty streets and warehouses. It was a risk, but it was better than letting them force her onto the freeway's shoulder. "Hang on!" she shouted again as she swerved onto the exit ramp, tires screeching. The SUV followed, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. The industrial streets were dark and empty, the only sounds the roar of engines and the screech of tires against asphalt. Amelia took a sharp turn, trying to lose the SUV in the maze of warehouses, but the vehicle stayed close behind, relentless. "They're not giving up," Ethan yelled. Amelia scanned the area quickly and spotted an old loading dock ahead. "Get ready to jump," she shouted. "What?" "Trust me." Amelia jerked the wheel sharply, skidding the car into the alleyway next to the loading dock. Before the SUV could react, she and Ethan flung their doors open and sprinted toward the building. The sound of the SUV screeching to a halt behind them echoed through the narrow alley. "Go, go!" Amelia shouted, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him toward a side door. They crashed through it into the darkness of the warehouse, the musty air filling their lungs as they ran. Footsteps and shouting followed close behind. "They're coming!" Ethan hissed, pulling the flash drive from his pocket and shoving it into Amelia's hand. "Take it. I'll hold them off." "No," Amelia said sharply, turning to face him. "We do this together." Ethan hesitated, then nodded, his breathing hard. They moved deeper into the warehouse, the echoes of pursuit growing louder. Amelia's grip tightened on the flash drive as adrenaline coursed through her veins. "We're going to get out of this," Ethan said, his voice low but certain. Amelia glanced at him, her jaw set. "We have to." The air inside the abandoned warehouse was thick with dust and tension. Amelia gripped the flash drive tightly in her hand as she and Ethan crouched behind a stack of rusted metal barrels. Their ragged breaths were the only sounds in the cavernous space, apart from the echoing footsteps and distant voices of the men pursuing them. "They're splitting up," Ethan whispered, peeking around the edge of the barrels. "They're trying to flank us." Amelia nodded, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew Henderson's tactics: well, divide and isolate. He had been a predator from the start, lurking in the shadows, and now he was hunting them down like prey. But Amelia wasn't about to let him win. Not here, not now. "We need to move," she whispered back, her voice low and steady. "If they corner us, we're done." Ethan's eyes met hers, his face tense but resolute. "You lead. I'll follow." Amelia scanned the warehouse. Moonlight filtered in through the broken windows, casting long beams across the floor. Old crates and machinery littered the space, providing just enough cover to slip through unnoticed if they were careful. She spotted a metal staircase on the far side, leading up to a second-floor platform. It might give them a way out. "There," she whispered, nodding toward the stairs. "We'll make for that platform. Stay low." Ethan nodded, and together they began to move. Amelia's boots barely made a sound as she crept forward, her body coiled with tension. Every step felt like a lifetime, each creak of the floor a warning that someone might hear them. Suddenly, the faint beam of a flashlight swept across the far wall. "Check over there!" a voice barked. It was Henderson. Amelia froze, pressing herself against the side of a crate. Ethan did the same, his eyes locked on her, waiting for a signal. They stayed still as statues, the beam of light growing closer before it swept away again. "Hurry," Amelia whispered, motioning for Ethan to follow. They reached the base of the staircase, the old metal groaning softly as Amelia tested the first step. She winced at the sound, but there was no time to worry about it now. Carefully, they ascended one step at a time, the noise of their pursuers muffled below. Halfway up, a sudden crash echoed through the warehouse. "They're upstairs," Henderson's voice roared, reverberating off the walls. Amelia's blood ran cold. "Move!" she hissed. Ethan didn't hesitate. They sprinted up the remaining steps, the platform trembling beneath their weight. At the top, Amelia glanced around quickly, searching for an escape route. There was a small service door leading to what she hoped was a fire escape. There, she pointed. Ethan ran to the door and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It's locked, he cursed. Amelia darted over, her heart pounding as she looked back down the staircase. Flashlights flickered below, and the pounding of boots grew louder. They were coming. Let me try, Amelia said, her voice sharp. She pulled a small utility knife from her pocket, wedging it into the lock mechanism. Years of experience had given her the tools to handle moments like this, and she worked quickly, her fingers steady despite the chaos around her. Hurry, Ethan muttered, glancing nervously at the stairs. Almost there, Amelia replied. The lock clicked, just as Henderson's men reached the base of the staircase. The sound of their shouting spurred Amelia forward, and she shoved the door open. Go! Ethan bolted through first, and Amelia followed, slamming the door shut behind her. They emerged onto a narrow metal fire escape, the cool night air hitting them like a wave. The fire escape clung to the side of the building, creaking with every step as they hurried down. Below, the alley stretched out in eerie silence, bathed in pale moonlight. We're almost out, Ethan said, glancing over his shoulder. The sound of the door crashing open above them made Amelia's stomach drop. She looked up to see Henderson standing on the platform, his flashlight sweeping the fire escape. His face was twisted with rage, and his voice carried down to them like thunder. You can't run forever, Brooks, he bellowed. You're finished. Amelia ignored him, forcing herself to focus on the alley below. Keep moving. They descended the last flight of stairs, Ethan landing first and holding the ladder steady as Amelia climbed down. Her boots hit the pavement with a thud, and they took off running down the alley. Behind them, Henderson and his men were already giving chase, their shouts and footsteps echoing in the narrow space. We need to lose them, Ethan called, glancing back. Amelia spotted an opening ahead, an old, overgrown fence that separated the alley from another street. Over here! They sprinted toward the fence, adrenaline pumping through their veins. Ethan reached it first, hoisting himself up and over before turning to help Amelia. She tossed the flash drive to him. Go, she ordered. I'm not leaving you, Ethan shouted, grabbing her wrist and helping her over the top. They landed hard on the other side, crashing into tall grass and weeds. Ethan pulled Amelia up, and they ran again, this time bursting onto a quiet residential street. The houses were dark, their windows shuttered, and the only sound was the pounding of their footsteps on the pavement. Where's the car? Ethan panted. 2 blocks that way, Amelia replied, pointing down the road. They sprinted toward the parked car, their lungs burning. When they finally reached it, Amelia yanked open the door and threw herself inside, Ethan diving into the passenger seat. She jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life as she slammed her foot on the gas. Headlights appeared in the rear-view mirror. Seconds later, Henderson's SUV was close behind. They're still coming, Ethan said, his voice sharp. Amelia's grip on the wheel tightened as she swerved onto a main road, the tires screeching. They won't catch us. She weaved through the empty streets, her mind laser-focused on one goal, getting to safety. Henderson's headlights loomed larger in the mirror, gaining on them. He was relentless, determined to finish what he had started. Left up ahead, Ethan shouted. Amelia spun the wheel hard, taking the turn at a sharp angle. The SUV followed but fishtailed slightly on the slick pavement, buying them a precious few seconds. Ethan looked at her, his expression serious. We need to call Foster. She can send backup. Amelia nodded and tossed him her phone. Do it. Tell her we're bringing the footage. Ethan dialed quickly, holding the phone to his ear as Amelia focused on the road. Foster, it's Ethan. We've got the footage, but Henderson's chasing us. We're heading to the South Bridge. Send backup. Amelia sped through the quiet city streets, the SUV still close behind. But as they approached the bridge, a flash of blue and red lights appeared on the horizon. Police cruisers blocked the far end of the bridge, their lights slicing through the darkness like beacons. "It's Foster," Ethan said, relief flooding his voice. "She's here." Amelia exhaled sharply, her shoulders finally loosening. She drove onto the bridge, the roar of the engine echoing against the steel structure. The SUV behind them slowed, then skidded to a stop as Henderson realized what was happening. Amelia pulled up alongside the waiting cruisers, her heart still racing. Officers poured out of their cars, weapons drawn, as Henderson's vehicle stopped in the distance. Lieutenant Foster stepped forward, her face calm but commanding. "It's over, Henderson!" she shouted across the bridge. "Stand down now!" For a moment, Henderson's SUV sat still, the headlights glaring like angry eyes. Then the driver's door opened, and Henderson stepped out. His face was dark with fury, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice echoing across the bridge. "She's the problem, not me." Foster held her ground. "You're done. Drop your weapon and get on the ground." Amelia stepped out of the car, the flash drive clutched tightly in her hand. Henderson's eyes locked onto her, his face contorting with hatred. For a moment, Amelia thought he might try to fight back, to make one last, desperate move. But then the officers surrounded him, weapons raised, and Henderson's shoulders slumped. He dropped to his knees, his hands raised as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Amelia exhaled, the tension finally breaking. She turned to Foster, holding up the flash drive. "We've got everything we need," she said quietly. Foster nodded, her expression softening. "You did good, Brooks. It's over now." Amelia looked out at the city beyond the bridge, the faint glow of dawn just beginning to light the horizon. For the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. The sun had just begun to rise as Amelia sat alone on a bench outside the Internal Affairs office, the faint glow of dawn chasing away the long shadows of the night. The building was quiet, the hum of the city slowly waking up beyond its walls. It had been hours since Henderson had been taken into custody, his protests drowned out by the sound of cuffs snapping around his wrists. Hours since Amelia and Ethan had handed the flash drive the unedited footage over to Internal Affairs. The evidence had spoken for itself. Amelia ran a hand through her hair, exhaustion weighing her down like an anchor. The tension that had held her together for days was starting to unravel, leaving her feeling hollow and unsteady. She stared down at her scraped knuckles, the tiny cuts a reminder of the fight she had been through. "Captain Brooks?" Amelia looked up to see Ethan standing nearby, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. His shirt was wrinkled, and dark circles had formed under his eyes, but his familiar lopsided smile was still there. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing her a cup. "Thanks," Amelia replied softly, taking it and letting the warmth seep into her cold hands. Ethan sat beside her on the bench, stretching out his legs with a heavy sigh. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence felt earned, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had just been through. "They're reviewing the footage now," Ethan said finally. "Internal Affairs has already called in a team to comb through Henderson's records. It's not just you, Amelia. There's a trail of bad cases, complaints, everything he tried to hide." Amelia took a sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on the horizon as the light crept further across the city. "It's what I suspected. He's been doing this for a long time. I just happened to be the one who wouldn't stay quiet." Ethan turned to look at her. "You didn't just stay quiet, you fought back. A lot of people would have folded under the pressure, Amelia. Not you." She shook her head, a bitter smile crossing her lips. "You make it sound brave. Half the time, I felt like I was barely holding it together." "That's what makes it brave," Ethan replied quietly. "You stood up when it would have been easier to walk away. That takes more courage than most people have." Amelia fell silent, Ethan's words lingering in her mind. She had spent her entire career fighting for others, fighting for justice in a flawed system, but this battle had been different, personal, ugly. It had tested every piece of her. And yet, here she was, still standing. Before either of them could speak again, the glass doors of the Internal Affairs office opened, and Lieutenant Foster stepped outside. Her sharp blue eyes softened slightly when they settled on Amelia, and she gave a small nod as she approached. "They're processing everything now," Foster said, stopping in front of them. "Henderson's going to face a long list of charges. The footage, Henry Walker's statement, and his track record, there's no way he's walking away from this." Amelia exhaled, the weight on her shoulders lifting just a little more. "Thank you, Lieutenant, for everything." Foster crossed her arms, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "You don't need to thank me, Brooks. You did the hard part. All I did was back the right person." Amelia looked at her, gratitude flickering in her tired eyes. "It means a lot to know someone believed me." Foster's gaze softened. "It's easy to believe in you when you've spent years earning it." She paused, glancing between Amelia and Ethan. "You'll both need to get some rest, but I'd recommend preparing yourselves for what comes next. This isn't over." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, frowning. "Henderson's gone down, but the fallout's just starting," Foster said. "His supporters in the department won't disappear overnight. There'll be questions, anger, and division. Some people won't want to admit they backed the wrong person. You're going to face backlash, Amelia." Amelia nodded slowly. She had already suspected as much. Exposing Henderson was the right thing to do, but that didn't mean it would come without consequences. Some officers would resent her for challenging one of their own. Others would see her as a reminder of the system's flaws, a truth they would rather ignore. "I can handle it," Amelia said, her voice firm. Foster studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I know you can." The ride back to Amelia's apartment was quiet, but it carried a different weight than before. The fear that had hung over them for days had eased, replaced by something quieter, but no less heavy, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and uncertainty about what came next. When they reached her building, Ethan stopped the car and turned to her. "You going to be okay?" Amelia smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth tugging upward. "I will be. What about you?" Ethan smirked, though his eyes were kind. "I'll get some sleep for once. I think we've earned it." She nodded, reaching for the door handle. "Thanks for sticking with me, Ethan. I wouldn't have gotten through this without you." "You don't have to say it," Ethan replied, his tone softer now. "That's what partners are for, Amelia." With that, she stepped out of the car and headed inside. The apartment felt empty, but peaceful, a quiet she had missed more than she realized. She set her keys on the table and collapsed onto the couch, letting her body sink into the cushions. The events of the past few days played in her mind like a reel. Henderson's smirk, Henry's trembling hands, the sound of gunfire in the woods, and the click of the cuffs around Henderson's wrists. It felt surreal, almost like someone else's story. But it wasn't. It was hers. She sat up slowly, glancing toward the shelf where a photo of her mother rested. Her mother's smile was just as she remembered it, warm, strong, and steady. Amelia reached for the frame, her fingers brushing over the glass. "Hard times don't last," she whispered, repeating the words her mother had so often said. "But strong people do." Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but they were not from sadness. They were from relief, from the realization that she had made it through the storm. The system had tried to break her. Henderson had tried to bury her, but she was still here. Amelia sat back, letting her thoughts quiet for a moment. The truth was out, and justice had begun to take its course. It would take time for the department to heal, for trust to be restored, but Amelia believed it could happen. There were good people in the ranks, people like Foster, Ethan, and even Henry Walker, who had found the courage to stand up for what was right. She thought of the young woman at the convenience store, the one who had whispered, "I saw everything. I'll tell someone." Amelia had not seen her since, but that simple act of kindness had given her strength when she needed it most. It reminded her that even in the darkest moments, there were still people willing to do what was right. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her thoughts. She reached for it and saw a message from Foster. Henderson's confession just came through. He's done. You won, Brooks. Amelia stared at the words for a moment, letting them sink in. She had won not just for herself, but for everyone who had been hurt by people like Henderson. The fight had been ugly, exhausting, and painful, but it had been worth it. She leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes. Tomorrow, she would face the department, the questions, and the stares. She would rebuild what Henderson had tried to destroy, piece by piece. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. Amelia stood outside the precinct the next morning, staring up at the familiar brick building she had once considered her second home. The morning sun reflected off the windows, casting long streaks of light across the sidewalk. For the first time in days, Amelia felt calm, as though the storm had finally passed. But she also knew what awaited her inside: questions, whispers, and the weight of rebuilding what had been broken. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy glass door. The station buzzed with its usual energy. Phones rang, officers hurried back and forth with files tucked under their arms, and voices bounced off the walls. But the moment Amelia stepped into the room, a hush fell over the lobby. Heads turned, conversations stopped. Eyes, some curious, others wary, followed her as she walked through. Amelia held her head high. She would not shrink under the weight of their stares. "Brooks!" a voice called out. Amelia turned to see Lieutenant Rachel Foster approaching, her sharp gaze focused but steady. Foster's usual calm demeanor was a welcome anchor, a reminder that Amelia still had allies here. "Lieutenant?" Amelia greeted. Foster nodded, her voice firm but warm. "Internal Affairs issued their findings this morning. Henderson's officially suspended pending his formal charges. Word's spreading fast. Most of the department knows the truth by now." "And the rest?" Amelia asked, though she already knew the answer. "Some are angry, some are embarrassed, and a few are still holding on to the story Henderson tried to spin," Foster replied honestly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Amelia, but this is a start." Amelia exhaled slowly, absorbing Foster's words. She had known there would be fallout. Henderson's lies had been calculated, and some people would cling to them out of pride or fear. But the truth was now out, and that was what mattered. "Ethan's waiting for you in the bullpen," Foster said, motioning toward the hallway. "You'll want to talk to him." "Thanks, Lieutenant," Amelia said, offering a faint smile. Foster gave a small nod before turning back to her own work. The bullpen was quieter than usual when Amelia stepped inside. The open space lined with desks, whiteboards, and bulletin boards felt heavier somehow, as if everyone was holding their breath. Officers paused in their work to look at her, their expressions unreadable. Amelia forced herself to stay calm, ignoring the weight of their gazes as she walked across the room. Ethan was at his desk, flipping through a stack of files. When he saw her, he stood up, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good to see you back where you belong, Captain," he said, his tone light but sincere. Amelia returned his smile. "Good to be back." Ethan handed her a file, his voice dropping lower. "Foster's right. Most people are talking about what happened. It's a mess, but at least it's the truth. You took Henderson down, Amelia. People are starting to wake up to what he was." Amelia flipped the file open, scanning the report. Henderson's charges were extensive falsifying evidence, witness tampering, abuse of power, and IA had begun pulling old complaints against him, the ones that had been swept under the rug. There were more victims, more people who had suffered under his corruption. "This was bigger than just me," Amelia said quietly, closing the file. "It always was." Ethan nodded. "And because of you, it's out in the open now. That's not nothing, Amelia." She looked at him, gratitude softening her expression. Thanks, Ethan, for sticking with me. Always, he replied simply. Amelia spent the next few hours in her office, catching up on reports and sifting through the aftermath of the case. Her desk was piled with files and post-its reminders of everything that had been put on hold while she fought for her name. She barely noticed the knock at her door until it opened and Henry Walker stepped inside. Amelia looked up in surprise, setting her pen down. Henry looked better than the last time she had seen him. He stood a little taller, his shoulders less hunched, though his hands still fidgeted nervously at his sides. "Henry," Amelia said, standing, "it's good to see you." Henry swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. I wasn't sure if I should come." "You're always welcome here," Amelia replied, her voice gentle. "Have a seat." Henry sat in the chair across from her desk, shifting uncomfortably. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I just wanted to say thank you. For not giving up. For believing me when I told you the truth." Amelia shook her head. "You're the one who did the hard part, Henry. You told the truth when it mattered most. That took courage." Henry looked up at her, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Do you think it'll get better? That people like Henderson won't always get away with things?" Amelia leaned forward, resting her arms on the desk. "I think change takes time, but every time someone stands up and does the right thing, like you did, we take another step in the right direction. It doesn't happen all at once, but it happens." Henry nodded slowly, her words sinking in. For the first time, his face relaxed into something that looked like hope. "Thanks, Captain Brooks. I needed to hear that." "You're welcome, Henry," Amelia replied with a small smile. "And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Henry stood, his movements less hesitant now. "I won't forget what you did for me." As he left, Amelia watched him go, a sense of peace settling over her. Henry had been caught in Henderson's web, but he had found the courage to break free. That mattered. Later that afternoon, Amelia walked the precinct halls with steady strides. She stopped near the break room where a group of younger officers huddled together, their voices low as they glanced in her direction. Amelia didn't hesitate. She stepped into the room, the quiet conversation halting immediately. All eyes turned to her. "Morning," Amelia greeted, her voice calm but firm. "I know there's been a lot of talk lately, a lot of questions." No one spoke, but their attention stayed on her. Amelia crossed her arms. "What happened with Henderson should never have happened, and I won't pretend it wasn't ugly. But this department doesn't belong to men like him. It belongs to us, to the ones who show up every day to do the right thing, to serve the people who trust us." A few of the officers nodded quietly, though others looked down at their coffee cups, unwilling to meet her gaze. Amelia didn't press them. She knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but she had planted a seed. "If you have doubts, questions, or concerns about what happened, come talk to me," she said, her tone softening. "My door is open, always." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving the officers to think about her words. As the sun began to set over the city, Amelia found herself sitting on the steps outside the precinct, the day's events slowly catching up with her. She watched as cars passed by, pedestrians moved along the sidewalks, and the world continued on as if nothing had happened. Foster joined her a moment later, a file tucked under her arm. "You all right?" Amelia nodded, though her eyes stayed on the horizon. "I think so." Foster sat beside her, her voice thoughtful. "You did good, Brooks. What you went through. Most people wouldn't have made it out intact." Amelia smiled faintly. "I had help. You, Ethan, Henry. Even that woman in the store who spoke up when no one else would." Foster nodded. "Sometimes it's the small kindnesses that make the biggest difference." Amelia looked out at the fading sun, its light stretching across the city like a promise. "I used to think strength meant standing on your own, but I've realized it's about knowing when to lean on others, when to accept their help." Foster stood, tucking the file under her arm. And knowing when to fight. Amelia smiled, rising to her feet. Yeah, that too. As she stood on the steps of the precinct, the building behind her and the city in front of her, Amelia felt something she hadn't felt in days: peace. She knew the fight for justice would never be truly over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The system was flawed, but it could be better. It had to be. Amelia turned toward the city, her resolve steady. Tomorrow would come, and she would face it head on. Because hard times didn't last, but strong people did. Amelia stood for a moment longer on the precinct steps, feeling the cool evening breeze against her skin. The city she had sworn to protect stretched out before her, alive and imperfect, but filled with possibility. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be challenges, doubts, and those unwilling to accept the truth. But she had faced darkness and come out the other side stronger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Amelia smiled softly to herself. This was not the end of her fight. It was only the beginning. She would keep pushing, keep striving, and keep standing up for what was right. Because at the heart of it all, there was hope, and hope was worth everything. If you enjoyed Amelia's story of resilience, courage, and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Your voices make our community stronger. Stay hopeful, stay kind, and we'll see you in the next story. Have a great day.